Following the Israelites' crossing of the Jordan River and Joshua's circumcising the generation that wasn't circumcised and the celebration of Passover, we read in the final verses of chapter 5 of a mysterious encounter that Joshua has. And it was when Joshua was in Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" So Joshua sees this person with a sword, and he approaches him and asks the logical question, "Are you with us or against us?" The answer, and he said, "No, but I am the captain of the Lord's army. I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and prostrated himself and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Remove your sandal from your foot, for the place upon which you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. What is the meaning of this very short, succinct scene that ends chapter 5? In chapter 6, we begin the story of the conquest of Jericho. Why does the captain of the Lord's army appear before Joshua? And what is the significance of this scene? One of the more mysterious episodes in the book. Instinctively, we would answer in light of the juxtaposition, the placement of this episode right before the story of the conquest of Jericho, and the actual statement that it occurs in Jericho, even though they're not yet in Jericho. We have to understand this is in the vicinity of Jericho. And the identity of this man who appears before Joshua, that the purpose of this visit is to encourage Joshua in preparation for the war against Jericho, the first battle that will be fought on the west side of the Jordan River. And Joshua is informed that he's not alone in this battle, but he has some support. From whom? From the captain of the Lord's army, none other than the captain of the Lord's army. In other words, this person who would seem to be an angelic figure, celestial figure, representing the power, the forces of God, and he will be with Joshua and help in his military campaign. That is the overwhelming understanding, right, of the vast majority of commentators, both old and present day modern commentaries. However, when read closely, there seems to be some difficulties with this understanding. First, the stature of the man and how he appears. He appears with his sword drawn in his hand. And we can infer from Joshua's reaction that this sword, which, person appearing with a sword drawn, seems to be in a combative military mode. And Joshua was apprehended and frightened by this, and therefore he wants to understand, who is this? And apparently we can infer from his question, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" that in all likelihood this man's sword was drawn perhaps even in the direction of Joshua. And therefore, Joshua wasn't certain. Who are you with? Who are you fighting against? All right. But then we move on and things even get more difficult and raise greater questions. because look at the response. And he said, no. In other words, no is to what? Are you for us or for our adversaries? Now, if the purpose of this apparition would be to encourage Joshua, then what should have been the answer? I am for us. I'm with you. But that's not what the man answers. He answers no, which seems to be a rejection of both possibilities. Namely, I'm not for you or against you. That is not a good way to encourage somebody that you are here to support him. I'm none of them. I am the captain of the Lord's army. And Joshua then falls on his face and I guess wants to hear, okay, why have you appeared? What do you want to tell me? What is the purpose of your visit? Now, what would we expect him to say if the whole purpose was to encourage him that he will be with him now in the upcoming battle over Jericho, that I have come here and I will be with you. God will be with you in the war. But that's not what he says. What does he say? A very short message. Remove your sandal from your foot, for the place upon which you stand is holy. That's it. In light of what we read here, I believe we have to raise some questions and skepticism regarding the traditional explanation that this appearance is in order to encourage Joshua and inform that God will be with him in the war. It's of course natural to think so because it appears, it happens on the verge of the war in Jericho right before the onset of chapter 6. So naturally, it was always connected to what appears immediately following. However, the content itself doesn't lend support to this understanding. The appearance of the man in an intimidating fashion with this outstretched arm and sword, which probably frightened Joshua, and his response to Joshua's query, saying, no, I'm none of them. I'm not for you nor against you, as if I'm an objective, observer sent from the army of God. And also the content of his words, namely, all he says is remove your sandal because this is holy, this is a holy place. All these, I believe, call into question the typical understanding of this whole episode as one that is meant to encourage Joshua before battle. So if that's not the case, then what is the purpose of this appearance? And I believe that is probably more likely to view this appearance in connection with what appears earlier, not afterwards. In other words, it doesn't seem like it's meant to encourage Joshua in preparation for the war over Jericho, but rather, if we summarize the content, this Lord of this captain of the Lord's army is indeed intimidating Joshua and warning him that this is holy land. And the purpose is not encouragement, but rather a warning. And hence, I think it connects in light of the content with what preceded, not what comes after. Namely, chapter 5 discussed the events that occur right after the crossing of the Jordan, entry into the promised land. And that included acts of sanctification via circumcision and celebrating the holiday of Passover. And we already discussed these as events and actions that prepare the Israelites for acquiring the land. In other words, these are preconditions for being able to inherit the land. Circumcision and Passover, representing the two aspects of the covenant between God and the father of the Israelite people, Abraham, the covenant of the pieces, which discusses the whole future enslavement in Egypt, and the covenant of circumcision. And these are conditions for being able to inherit the land. All these are acts of sanctification and preparation, right, for the inheritance of the land. What immediately follows? A personal warning to Joshua, the leader of the Israelites. And this warning is, be aware of where you stand. You are now on holy land, right? Warning. And I sense here that this mysterious appearance is not so much an appearance of encouragement, but rather of warning in light of the holiness. You are now on holy land. Take off your sandals. Beware. Act appropriately. And I believe then that we should view this as another stage in the preparation for inheriting the land. It's as if this captain of the Lord's army is the guard, right, to the entry of the land, and he informs Joshua before beginning his conquest, be aware of where you are. This is not any simple land. This is holy land. Take off your sandals and respect the location to which you have now arrived. Now, if I would ask you, does this scene remind you of any other scene you're familiar with from the Bible? I imagine that for some of you, this rings a bell and is reminiscent of an event that takes place in the very beginning of Moses' career as a prophet. I'm referring, of course, to that famous story of the burning bush. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses was pasturing the flocks of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flocks after the wilderness, and he came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from within the bush. And behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not being consumed. So Moses said, let me turn now and see this great spectacle. Why does the bush not burn up? The Lord saw that he had turned to see, and God called to him from within the bush, and he said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not draw near here. Take your sandals off your feet, because the place upon which you stand is holy soil. So if we compare these two events, the burning bush episode in the time of Moses, which is the very beginning of Moses' prophetic career, when God appears before him for the first time, and the appearance of the captain of the Lord's army. So in both instances, there is an apparition or something which appears before the leader. The leader in both instances notices, of course, Moses is not yet leader, but the future leader, notices, draws near. In the case of Joshua, he approaches and asks a question. In the case of Moses, God begins to speak. And in both instances, we have basically a message being sent. And the message is pretty much identical, at least in its beginning, with the captain of God's army saying to take off sandal, and the Lord's voice this time calling and telling Moses as well to take off his sandals because the land is holy. Striking similarities between the two, with some slight differences. Here it is the angel of God with Joshua, the captain of God's army. So it's like an angel representing God's army. Whereas with Moses, it's not a human apparition, but the sight of the burning bush. And it is the Lord himself who speaks to Moses. This, of course, this difference may, of course, represent a difference in prophecy, where Moses' prophecy is the highest level of prophecy, where God appears and speaks to him face to face, if you will. Whereas other prophets, through symbols or angels or hearing the voice, but not as a direct kind of revelation. But in any event, the content seems very similar. We must say that in the case of Moses, God, of course, continues afterwards and then informs Moses of his mission. And that also may be an explanation for the form of the appearance, the burning bush, explained by some commentators. The bush that doesn't get eaten, is not consumed by fire, may represent Israel itself, right? Which is enslaved and suffering, but is never consumed and continues to survive and exist. In any event, what is clear here is that there is a parallel. Some scholars indeed believe that our event with the captain of God's army may be missing a continuation of the message of the captain, and felt that the story seems to be cut off in mid progress. But we can only relate to it as it has arrived, and based on what we see, the message was that you are on holy ground, and hence the explanation that that was the message. Beware, you are on holy soil. That's, of course, what is also told to Moses. He is at the mountain of God, but then God continues with his mission. What can we make of this striking parallel, particularly the similar language of the command to take off your sandals from your feet because of the holy place? These two events, both taking place at a relatively early stage in the careers of the two leaders, draws a parallel between them, between Joshua and Moses. And of course, this connects with one of the central questions that the book of Joshua grapples with. What will happen following Moses, after the death of Moses? We saw that as a primary concern in chapter 1 of Joshua, after Moses has died. And here we may be getting a partial answer. What we see developing slowly in the book of Joshua is an analogy, comparison between Joshua and his predecessor Moses. And a lot of the events are similar. So just as Moses led the people and crossed the Red Sea and bring the people to safety, so does Joshua lead the people crossing the Jordan River. So we have a miracle crossing of a body of water in both instances. And here we see another parallel, just as there was an appearance before Moses with a message to appreciate the holiness of the place and take off his sandals, so too do we see an appearance before Joshua with a similar message, warning of the holiness of this place. So far, the answer, will Joshua be able to continue that leadership role which Moses had? So far, the book of Joshua seems to want to answer, Joshua is indeed a continuation of that leadership of Moses.